if you have confidence that you can perform well in whatever your chosen skill is, you will perform better versus the opposite belief, which is that I suck at this, no confidence. People go, well, how can that be? And the answer is when you have strong positive beliefs, your mind-body connection, the communication between your brain and your body goes way up, which means your ability to coordinate the athletic motion is better, your timing is better, your rhythm's better, your tempo's better.
Welcome to The Golf Parent, where you get access to the best minds in junior golf. I'm your host, Ryan Adams, and my guest today is recognized as one of the game's best golf swing instructors and swing theorists, Jim Waldron. Jim has an extensive background in Eastern philosophy, psychology, and meditation practices, and he's the creator of the Balance Point Golf Peak Performance Model and the Balance Point Golf Schools. Jim's golf school has twice been chosen by Golf Magazine as one of the top 25 golf schools in the nation. He's been named the best teacher in the state of Oregon, and he's the peak performance golf coach at Portland State University and the University of Hawaii. Jim, I want to thank you for making the time to come on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate being here. This will be fun.
Yeah, this is going to be great. I'm looking forward to this because, Jim, you bring so many different, not only do you have decades of experience in golf instruction, but you bring kind of this esoteric spiritual aspect to the holistic approach to not only golf, but life. So I'm really excited to kind of delve into that aspect. But I know that in golf instruction, there seems to be an overemphasis on kind of the techniques and the technical aspect of instruction. But there's also seems to be this kind of a pragmatic experiential aspect. Like, what's the student actually experiencing? Maybe let's start the conversation there. What's your thought then on those two kind of sides of golf instruction?
Well, there's been a bias, particularly in golf instruction culture. And let's define what the word culture means. Culture means that there is a set of beliefs about human nature and about the nature of the physical world that if you're born in whatever culture you're born into, about 90% of that stuff gets basically imprinted into both at the level of the conscious mind and, more importantly, the unconscious mind. By the time you're 6 or 7 years old, you have to. It happens automatically. It's almost like osmosis. So we become culturally conditioned and to believe certain things about ourselves, what we're capable, what we're not capable of, our culture, society, and the nature of reality itself. And all of those things are literally stories or myths that we tell ourselves.
Interesting.
You know, at taxonomy, which is a part of science that has to do with categorizing different life forms, right? Which came about with a guy named Linnaeus back in the 17th century. But there's this idea that we call ourselves, we've been around for about 300,000 years, Homo sapiens, which means basically, technically it means man who thinks, or it means wise man, or you could even say it means a higher order primate who thinks. But I think it should be called Homo mythos, man or higher order ape who creates stories or myths. And the problem with that, there's a positive side to the myth-making aspect of human consciousness and a negative side. The negative side is obvious, that if you form a belief that creates suffering for yourself or suffering in the world writ large, like toxic political beliefs, we're seeing that today. Just look what the Ukrainians up to with, they're dealing with this madman, Vladimir Putin, who's got these beliefs that Ukraine's part of Russia, even though it's clearly not, right? Sure. And so all these people are suffering because Putin believes in this myth that he created for himself, right? So I can give example after example of how toxic beliefs create suffering, or at least let's call it psychological dysfunction, or if it's a belief in the realm of sports, creates athletic dysfunction, right? On the other hand, if you form beliefs that increase your positivity, that increase and strengthen the mind/brain to body connection, even if there's no evidence for that belief, the athlete's going to perform better. And I always use this example all the time in my teaching, one of several. There's a guy, if you're a serious golfer, you may know who this guy is, but there's a guy who was far and away the greatest putter on the planet. But only for 1 week every 2 years. You know what I'm talking about? What happens in golf every 2 years?
The Ryder Cup.
The Ryder Cup.
And
Yeah.
I would guess it's the Englishman that you're talking about,
Correct.
Poulter.
Correct. It's Ian Poulter. Yeah.
Yeah.
He is not that great. If you look at his putting stats on the they call it the DP World, the old European Tour, or when he plays here in the U.S. Tour, he's not terrible. He's like middle of the pack as a putter. But in the Ryder Cup, he makes everything, and he tells his caddy, he tells his opponents in the match play events, I'm going to make this putt and he does, like a hugely high percentage of the time. So that's an example of a belief that does not comport with evidence, with empirical reality. And yet, what's the harm of it? I mean, the worst that could happen is he stinks at putting in the Ryder Cup, and people kind of laugh at him for thinking, oh, Ian thinks he's a great putter, but but of course that's not the case. He's putting better, and you can apply that to anything in life. If you have confidence that you can perform well in whatever your chosen skill is, you will perform better, versus the opposite belief, which is that I suck at this, no confidence. People go, well, how can that be? And the answer is, when you have strong, positive beliefs, your mind-body connection, the communication between your brain and your body goes way up, which means your ability to coordinate the athletic motion is better, your timing is better, your rhythm's better, your tempo's better, your ability to compensate unconsciously for swing flaws goes way up when you have a strong mind-body connection. Yeah.
So I've got a question here that, Jim, so would it be fair to say then that if you have a strong mythos or a belief in yourself, that there's less kind of resistance between what you believe in your body? So for example, if you're at war with yourself thinking that, for example, in my own golf swing, whenever I hit a really nice drive, I always seem to flub the next shot, the approach shot. And I don't consciously go into it thinking this, but it's somewhere there rolling around the back of my head that I pat myself on the back. I'm like, that was the best drive of the day. And then it's literally a flub approach shot.
Yeah.
So is it because on some deep subconscious level, I'm at odds? My body's kind of a little bit resistant because somewhere I have got a story that I'm telling myself about this particular action, and then my body's kind of like doesn't know what to do because it doesn't know what to believe because I don't believe it.
Well, that's funny you bring that up, because it segues into another one of my big sort of overarching principles on the mental game, or how to improve athletic performance, which is called mind-body dualism versus mind-body connection. So anybody brought up in Western culture, again, we talked about the culture a few minutes ago, you've been conditioned as a child to believe that mind and body are separate aspects of human experience. It was a concept invented by the Greek philosophers 2,500 years ago. It's called mind-body dualism. From everything we know about science, particularly neuroscience, it's complete BS. There is no mind-body dualism. There's only a mind-body connection. Mind and body are two aspects of human experience that work together. They're not antithetical. They're not in conflict. But to answer your question, I would have to know what your handicap is, or what your skill level is. So what's your average score or your handicap right now?
Depends before or after my baby, but it got as low as a 14 and now it's hovering around a 16.
Yeah. So let's say, you're a mid handicap. So the thing you have to realize, every golf shot will always have two components: the quality of your psychological experience and the quality of your physical movement patterns, along with basically how you set up to the golf ball, how you grip the club, how you aim the club. Those are the three pre-swing fundamentals. So grip, aim, setup. Those three pre-swing physical fundamentals, you could be doing poorly. One or all three, you could be doing poorly, and that will definitely have a negative influence on what the ball flight is. So, in other words, I always joke that the greatest way to explain this is a guy right now who has the best mental game on the planet. The second best mental game on the planet is the great current, number one player in the world, Scotty Scheffler on the PGA Tour, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the greatest mental game in the planet, this is somewhat tongue in cheek, is the Dalai Lama, who's an enlightened Buddhist monk. He doesn't play golf. In other words, but trust me, I know this guy. If he's got an extremely calm, focused mind all the time, he doesn't get stressed out, he doesn't get angry, he doesn't get frustrated. So he's got all the things sports psychologists would say are the supreme examples of a really, really good mental game. But if he went and played golf with you and me, he would struggle to break 120 because his technique sucks. He hasn't learned the movement patterns. He hasn't learned how to hold the club properly, how to set up properly. So to answer your question, anytime someone hits a bad shot, even tour pros, there's always a physical element causing the bad shot, and there's almost always a mental element as well. And the higher your handicap, the more it tends to be on the physical side of the equation, and the lower your handicap, the more it tends to be on the mental side of the equation.
That makes a lot of sense. So for all the parents listening to this then right now, and they've got, their kids in some sort of instruction. So the technical aspect is potentially being taken care of, or at least addressed.
Yeah.
What about the mental side then? What can a parent do to help kind of bulletproof the Zen mind, if you will, or maybe bulletproof isn't the right way of saying it, but create a very Dalai Lama-like mind in their child to be able to handle the ups and downs, the stresses of a round of golf, the pressures of competition? What can we do as a parent to help arm our kids with this type of mindset?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would answer that it's the same thing you're doing when you're parenting the kid off the golf course. In other words, this applies to adults too, not just kids. The quality of your mental game when you're playing golf is a mirror image of the quality of your mental game in life itself. They're not separate. So people who have poor emotional intelligence, or people who are poor at psychological self-management off the golf course, are also going to struggle with it on the golf course, right? So what we're really talking about is more of a life issue as opposed to a sport or a golf issue, right? And one of the things that I'm a big fan of, and I sent you a kind of a long kind of a series of bullet points on this, and when we first emailed, is there's always been two ends of the spectrum, particularly in the modern era, since maybe my generation, baby boomers, since the late 1940s, early 1950s. There's been two extreme views on parenting in general, which are the strict authoritarian father view versus the softer, nurturing mother view. So you can call that the matriarchal view versus the patriarchal view.
Sure.
And in the 1950s and 60s, there was a guy named Dr. Benjamin Spock. The name of his book escapes me at the moment, but he wrote this. It was the #1 best-selling book for like a year on the New York Times bestseller list. And he often gets criticized, even today, by conservatives for raising a generation of spoiled brats, because he was recommending way more on the nurturing side as opposed to the strict father side, right? And my view is you want to be exactly in the middle between those two extremes on the spectrum. So to raise a healthy child, you have to give them on a regular basis, moment-to-moment, daily basis, unconditional love and respect and kindness and compassion. But there also have to be rules in the household. There have to be boundaries. Kids need boundaries. And you can apply a rule to your child. You can apply a boundary to a child in a loving, kind, respectful, compassionate way. You don't have to get angry when you're enforcing the rules, which basically means when the child breaks the rule and engages in some type of antisocial behavior, right? There have to be consequences, not spanking, not physical abuse, not emotional abuse, obviously, but some type of consequence. Because if you didn't apply consequences as a parent, you're going to raise a narcissist who thinks he or she is the center of the universe, which leads to immoral behavior as an adult, maybe even downright criminal behavior as an adult. So we always want to have a balance between those two extremes, I think is an overall parenting philosophy. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It 100% does. And what that's making me think is also the importance of me getting my own, middle way sense of balance together, because obviously there's the large element of modeling that happens with our children and modeling us. So if we're golfing with our children and they see us throwing clubs, throwing tantrums, poor body language, poor self-talk, all the rest of that, well, then guess what? We can't really blame our child for also emulating those or taking on those poor behaviors or self-destructive tendencies.
Yeah, that's a great bullet point. Yeah, so I always say kids do not do what you tell them they do. They do what you do. They model your behavior at least until around age 10. So the first 10 years are vitally important. So I always tell people, look, the kid's already born more or less healthy. So your job is to not screw the kid up, basically. And one way you can help the kid grow into a healthy adult is to be the best adult that you can be, that you and your spouse can be. So the behaviors you exhibit are the behaviors you'd like the child to eventually grow into. So it puts the onus on the parent to monitor his or her own behavior, as opposed to doing something proactively to quote unquote parent the child. You don't need to quote unquote parent the child. Just be a good role model. That's like 90% of it, right?
I'm laughing because what I'm thinking about is when I first got a dog years ago, it was right in kind of the peak of Caesar Milan's popularity. And I remember watching a lot, exactly. And we would always watch, some of the episodes. It'd be fantastic. But they always ended the same way. It's like, hey, your dog is not broken, you're broken. Your dog isn't bad, doesn't need you behavior.
Pretty much his philosophy. Yeah.
Right, exactly. It's always like I need to reteach the human or the actual caregiver of the dog. And I always thought it was kind of funny, but it really seems to be true with parenting as well. There's
no question. And then the third thing to answer your question is that I'm a big fan of this one too. That's a big part of how I teach the mental game. And I think I'm the number one yips coach on the planet. So I work with athletes, mostly golfers, but also other sports. And I have basically for in-person instruction, I have a 99% cure rate. And on the webcam, it's 93% cure rate within about 4 to 6 months of being on the program. People stop yipping, right? And one of the reasons why people yip is they've never learned to detach or decouple their sense of self-worth from the outcome of the shot or the score, what the scorecard says. So in other words, when you're coupling your self-worth to performance, you're creating intense psychological stress, which tends to lead to dysfunction and poor performance. And the greatest example of this is the famous boxer Muhammad Ali. Now, when he was a kid, he didn't adopt the name Muhammad Ali until he was in his, I think it was late 20s, early 30s. He became a Muslim. He was called, his birth name was Cassius Clay. So when he was 11 years old, he took up boxing. And his first mentor in life was his boxing coach. And the boxing coach was a very wise man. And he said to the young Cassius, you've got a lot of talent for boxing, but your record of success is quite poor. And the reason why it's quite poor is you feel bad about yourself when you lose in the ring. And he proactively taught young Cassius Clay to completely separate his sense of self-worth from both success and failure in the boxing ring. Meaning he taught the kid to love himself unconditionally. And that's a really big deal in sports. So what I advise parents who have young golfers especially is you've got to keep giving the kid feedback. It's okay to fail. It's okay to lose. You'll learn something. You actually learn more from failure than you do from success. But when you fail, that doesn't mean you're a bad person because you failed. It doesn't even mean you're a bad golfer. It just means today you didn't do your best. And there could be a number of reasons why that happens. It happens to the best players in the world. They have off days, right? So the idea of total separation of self-esteem from performance is another really big deal for parents who are coaching young athletes.
What would be maybe one or two practical tips that you could advise a parent that they could use to help disassociate the child's sense of well-being or the sense of their parents' love from the outcome of the round or how well they're playing or scoring that day?
Yeah, it's just that. It's just having a conversation, and there's no simple tip. It's just a matter of on a regular basis, letting the kid know when they fail. It's not when they fail to win the game, or if they had a game-winning shot attempt with 2 seconds left on the clock in basketball in the fourth quarter. And let's say it's not even that hard. Let's say they're inside the paint, right? So they're close to the basket. So it's kind of an easy shot, and they flub it, which can happen, right? Happens every day on basketball courts all over the world.
Of course.
I would tell, if it was my child, I would say, it's okay, honey. It's okay. Sometimes when you try your hardest, you're still going to miss the shot. It's okay. Michael Jordan had that happen to him when he was, even in the NBA, he had it happen, let alone in high school and college, right? Elementary school. So in other words, failure is part of life. And learning to accept failure, or let's call it the big picture would be, with Buddhist word would be suffering. Suffering happens. And it's how you react to the suffering that happens that determines how long the suffering lasts and how big of impact it has on your psychological well-being. if you accept that suffering is an inevitable part of the game, and in a bigger picture, it's an inevitable part of life, and you develop a sense of unconditional self-love, unconditional self-respect, unconditional confidence. When you do fail, when failure does happen, you won't take it personally. You'll accept it and you'll move on.
I don't think I've ever heard unconditional confidence. How would you describe unconditional confidence?
That's one of the things I'm really good at, apparently. What everybody who knows me says. It just simply means belief in yourself that's independent of recent historical evidence. So when I'm playing golf, yeah, in spite of the factual evidence, correct. When I'm playing golf, and I tell this to my students, but it happens to me sometimes. If I bogey the first 3 holes, that would be unusual for me. Or let's say even worse. Let's say I double bogey the first hole, bogey the second, double bogey the third. That's happened to me, not in decades. When I was a kid, it would happen. I would stand on the number 4 tee box with just as much confidence as I had on those 3 bad tee shots on 1, 2, and 3 tee box. In other words, even though I have a recent memory of screwing up the drive on the previous 3 holes with the driver in my hand, I don't let that affect my confidence to hit this shot. In other words, this applies again to life, not just to sports, but as a golfer, I have and I teach people how to have such unshakable, unconditional self-confidence that their confidence is not dependent on proof that in the last few days or the last few weeks or last few months, I'm hitting the driver well. Therefore, because of that, I deserve to feel confident now. And I'll give you another example from another sport. The great coach of UCLA, John Wooden, until recently had the greatest track record for college basketball.
Is he the gentleman that came up with that triangle? That's
he had called the pyramid. Well, it was a pyramid. He called it the pyramid of success. Yeah,
exactly.
But he did an interview years ago, long before he passed. And the interviewer, they were talking about confidence. And here's the story. He said, at UCLA basketball, we teach that confidence is a choice. Confidence is a skill, and it's not something that's only dependent on recent success. Because if it's based on recent success and you don't have any recent success because you're in a slump, all athletes get into slumps, or they get slightly injured enough to create failure. If you then let that recent failure affect your self-belief, your self-image, you're screwed. You're not going to be able to play well. So he said, at UCLA basketball, we recruit generally. This is back in the 70s and 80s when they were, by far and away the powerhouse in college basketball. He said we almost always recruit the number 1 statistically ranked high school basketball player comes to play with us as a freshman at UCLA. He goes, we often get the guy that's ranked number 12 in the nation statistically. But sometimes, as it happens, the guy who's ranked number 12 statistically has more confidence in his shooting ability under the gun than the guy ranked number 1. Who do you think I'm going to give the ball to with 2 seconds left on the clock in the fourth quarter? Not the guy ranked number 1. I'm going to give it to the guy ranked number 12 because that guy has more confidence than the guy that statistically is actually a better shooter. So confidence can be a skill. You should be able, but I teach this, you should be able to switch on or off any attitude, any emotional state, any belief, like turning on and off a switch. And I teach golfers how to switch off fear and switch on confidence.
I love that. Okay, so I'm going to bring this full circle to what we started the conversation with, which was talking about the stories that we tell ourselves and the fact that we are storytelling creatures, which it sounds like it's pretty obvious where that can go awry or where that doesn't serve us is when we're telling like a story that holds us back. Like, I'm not good at this, I'm not this, I'm not lovable, whatever those might be.
Right.
But it sounds to me like you're talking about now the positive side of storytelling, like I always perform under pressure. I thrive. Like these almost affirmations where you're telling a story, a positive spin to yourself to help kind of create that unshakable confidence. Am I understanding that correct?
Exactly that. All right. So here's another teaching story or teaching anecdote that I use. A few years ago when I was working with a YIP student, we were talking about confidence like we are now. He said to me, Jim, you seem like one of the more, I've been working with you for a couple of months now, and I have to say, you seem like a very confident person pretty much in general, right? I go, yeah, that's true. I've always been very confident. And friends and family know that about me. And he goes, well, why is that? I go, well, I remember my mom telling me from a very young age, she used to say, Jimmy, whatever you put your mind to, if you do your best and you put your mind to any skill, you can be somewhere between good at it and great at it. You'll never be really bad at it. So I always had that. So that's part of it. Part of it could be good genes, maybe good genetics. I happen to believe in reincarnation. So maybe in a past life, I was successful. But he said to me, so you're probably the most confident in your golf teaching ability. I go, no, not even close. He goes, really? Well, what is it? I go, well, it's kind of a weird thing. It's like a skill. He said, well, tell me what it is. I go, well, I don't really like talking about it because it's a very strange, kind of unusual thing. Anyhow, he convinced me. He goes, so what are you the most confident in? I go, I'm really good at street fighting. He was stunned. He goes, street fighting? I go, yeah. I got in lots of fights as a kid. And not because I was a bully, polar opposite. I wasn't a bully, but I was fighting bullies because I grew up in the 50s and 60s in a rough working class neighborhood in Chicago. And there were gangs and bullies, and there were fights in the schoolyard pretty much every day. And my parents taught me to never give in to a bully. So I had this mission that if a bully confronted me or one of my friends, I would stand up to the bully and then get in a fight with them. And he said, well, why are you confident? And I go, because I won every single fight. I never lost a fight. And he goes, well, how many were you in? And I said, well, give me a minute. So I did the math where I figured out, okay, 5 days a week at school, occasionally on the weekend. From age 6 to 22, I was in over 300 fights, and I won every single one. He goes, well, that's amazing. Well, no wonder you're confident. I go, well, it's even better than that. I would go into this famous thing that every athlete wants to go into, which is the so-called zone of peak performance to the utmost extent. And I said, when I was in those fights, every single time, my opponent appeared to me trying to punch me in slow motion, really slowly. And even today at age 73, as you can tell from seeing it, I can punch really fast. So when you can punch fast or kick fast or block fast, and your opponent is punching what appears to be in slow motion, nobody's going to lose the fight when you're in the zone, right? And that's partly how I got interested in consciousness and peak performance states from that very, very young age, right?
Trying to understand what was happening where time was almost slowing down.
Yeah, time would slow down, right? So anyhow, 55 years ago, my sister's current husband, then they had just met, were dating. He said to me, so your sister tells me that you were the toughest kid in the neighborhood. I go, yeah. And he goes, yeah. And she told me she was the toughest girl, which is true. My sister was the toughest female in the neighborhood. She didn't lose a fight either. So that's why I think it's genetic. But he said, well, so you suppose you could beat Bruce Lee in a fight? And I go, of course I could beat Bruce Lee in a fight. He goes, Jim, do you realize how crazy that sounds? He goes, oh, you probably think you could beat Muhammad Ali in a fight. I go, yeah, I could definitely beat Muhammad Ali in a fight. He goes, that is insane. I go, I won't tell you his name because of confidentiality, but I said, well, I'll call him Bill. His name isn't Bill. I said, Bill, here's the deal. I'm smart enough to know from a purely rational, logical perspective, what I just said is BS. Of course I could not beat Bruce Lee, who's way better than me at karate, although I did take high-end karate instruction for several years. And the same with Muhammad Ali. I wouldn't have a chance, logically, rationally. I know that rationally, my belief is not accurate. But the fact that I believe it means I'll last much longer in the fight and do better than if I had the opposite belief. So I'm choosing to believe something about myself that has no downsides. There's no downside to it, right? There's only upside. It doesn't have to match empirical fact. Now, there are some rules for that to prevent suffering for other people. Anytime you choose to form a belief about yourself, you have to ask yourself, if I choose to form this belief, does it violate the golden rule of ethics, which is do unto others the way you want them to treat you, right? So that's the foundation of all ethics and morality is the golden rule. So I would counsel anybody listening, ask yourself, if I choose this belief. So for example, you could choose to believe that you could drive at 120 miles an hour on the freeway and not get in an accident. You would get in an accident. So in that case, that type of false belief in your driving ability, your driving confidence, would inevitably cause suffering for yourself or other people, right? Makes sense? So you have to make sure it doesn't cause any type of suffering, yeah?
So what this is bringing to mind for myself is what I find as a mid-handicapper, and this is relevant to all of us parents that are teaching our kids golf, which is what I find is when I get nervous or I'm a little bit apprehensive when I'm making a shot, I almost inevitably end up doing exactly what I was afraid of anyway. So one of the mantras I almost tell myself is to at least make a confident swing. Like what would it look like, or what would it feel like if I had no fear and I was just swinging confidently, not worrying about any sort of repercussions? And oddly enough, probably not oddly to you, because this is your whole philosophy. The shot works out way better than it would have if I'm telling myself the other side. So what I'm hearing you're saying is that you have nothing to lose to instill this kind of unshakable confidence in yourself, regardless of what sort of external evidence. You can always find a reason to justify one way or the other. And it seems like the best golfers are able to pull up in their memory bank the time when they hit that perfect 5-iron right to 4 feet to the pin. And that's the memory that they want to focus on, not the 1,200 times where they missed the green with the 5.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah, why would you focus on the negative memory when you can just as easily pick a positive? A long time ago, I had a chance to interview the great Freddie Couples, the PGA Tour star back then. Well, he still is today on the senior tour. And I said to him, Freddie, what do you do if you're in a slump, say with your mid-irons, and you haven't hit a good 6-iron, say in the last 6 weeks? What do? He goes, oh, that's easy. I just vividly recall the last time I pured my 6-iron. And I asked myself, what was the sound like? What was the sound of impact like between ball and club face? Number one. What did it sound like? These are the 3 primary senses: vision, hearing, and feeling. What did I see? I see the ball arcing in the sky in line with the flag and landing and stopping next to the pin, right? And what did I feel in my body in terms of 3 things: balance, rhythm, and tempo? I wanted to feel, I'll recollect, I had rock solid balance, I had fluid rhythm, and I had smooth tempo. So he's recollecting in what we call kinesthetic memory or feel channel memory, balance, rhythm, and tempo. He's recalling auditory memory, the sound of solid impact, and visual memory, seeing the ball go to the target successfully. He goes, when I do that, I instantly feel confident that I can reproduce that shot now, at this moment, which is like brilliant, right? But almost no amateur golfers do that. They actually remember the bad shots rather than remember the good shots, which is crazy.
I'm 100% guilty of that, and I think as a mid handicapper, it's way more bad shots than it is good shots.
Well, of course,
but again, it doesn't serve.
That's why the answer is you just can't work on the mental side. You got to take quality instruction and fix your damn golf swing, fix your putting stroke, fix your chipping stroke. You got to learn to have a certain level of mastery over the body movement patterns. It's never all mind, right? And it's never all body either. It's always both, right?
I think it's a perfect segue to go. You're an expert in understanding the mind-body connection. Like, you had talked a little bit about some of the kinesthetic senses and how this plays into it.
Yeah.
Could you educate us parents on how to understand this connection, and then how potentially to teach it to our kids?
Yeah, well, I taught my kids this. I have two kids who are adults now, and I've taught my grandson this as well, which is basically the mind, the conscious mind. If you think of it, what is the essential nature of consciousness? And it functions exactly the way, if I was at your house and there was a power outage and you handed me a flashlight from the glove compartment of your car, and we both walk into your house and the city's in complete darkness, and I switch on the flashlight beam and I point it in a certain direction, and I see a TV, then I see a table, a chair. So the essential nature of consciousness, it creates information. It enlightens you as to what the reality of the present moment is. So it starts with that, understanding how consciousness works.
Depending on what you're focusing on, it'll bring that into your reality.
So consciousness is literally like a beam of light that provides new information about the world that you're paying attention to. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we, human beings, and all animals who have basically, I would argue all animals have some type of consciousness, but animals, particularly mammals, particularly primates, and whales and dolphins and octopus, there's a whole category of animals that are very, 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 highly intelligent. We're not the only ones on the planet, obviously, if you pay attention to current animal science. But we have the ability to experience 2 different worlds. There's an external world, the physical world is science, mainly physics study. So that's 3 spatial dimensions: length, width, and height. objects that have mass that can be measured and weighed. And the biggest objects in the universe are galaxies, and the smallest objects are subatomic, tiny like quarks, like subatomic particles, or photons in a beam of light. So it's 3 dimensions in space, objects that have mass, plus time, the 4th dimension. That's a real thing. When you die, the universe doesn't die with you. So the universe exists independent of human consciousness. Would you agree?
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, believe it or not, that's still a question in philosophy, which to me is crazy that it's still even being discussed.
Well, for those listeners, so just to so I can share, or at least so I understand your question. If the light of consciousness goes out inside of ourselves when we die, does the entire world disappear as well? It's kind of like the old question: if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around, does it actually make sense?
Similar to that.
Yeah. Whereas what we're saying is that your conscious, the world exists independent of your consciousness. Your consciousness, even if you die, can still experience a universe, and a universe.
Yeah, because everybody pretty much
still there.
Yeah, everybody listening to this pretty much has either had a friend or a family member or a pet die. And when the cat dies, the universe doesn't disappear. The universe is still there. So there is an external world independent of your mind, your consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Okay. We also have an internal world that's completely private. So not even your wife. Are you married? Are you
I am. Yeah.
Yeah. So not even your person you're closest to, let's call it your spouse or your wife, has ever been inside, even for a second, your private psychological bubble state. So everybody has a private psychological space. And in that space, the objects in that space are thoughts, memories of the past, hopes and fantasies of the future, your moral and ethical beliefs, your beliefs about yourself, what you're good at, what you're not good at, perceptions about what's happening inside that psychological space, and emotions. So all that stuff I just mentioned are the contents of your internal psychological space, right? Now, the thing that's important to remember is, and this is really, I think, one of the more radical insights of early Buddhist. So there was sort of we always talk about the European Enlightenment. Well, there was an enlightenment that happened 2,500 years ago in India when Buddhism took off, which is even more radical than the European Enlightenment, like not even close, in my view, which is that everything that happens in your psychological space is fundamentally not equivalent maybe, but similar to dreaming. When you're dreaming at night, you're paying attention to the dream, when in reality, your body is asleep in bed, but you're inhabiting a fantasy world that seems real when you're dreaming it, right? And what the early Buddhists discovered was when the alarm clock goes off and you wake up, you're still asleep. You're not fully awake, right? And so to me, this is one of the overarching principles in psychotherapy. As long as a person assigns a high degree of credibility to their memories of the past, to their fantasies or fears about the future, to their emotions, to their images of what they're good at, what they're not good at, particularly when they're negative, right? Like we talked about a minute ago, then you're going to have psychological dysfunction. So waking up to the reality that everything that takes place in your psychological space is fundamentally less real than the physical world, which is why the physical world is called reality, because it's more real than your internal psychological space. But athletes, or even just non-athletes, just people living their lives who suffer from various forms of neurosis, which is the technical term for mild to moderate psychological dysfunction, not the only reason, but one of the primary reasons why someone is going to be experiencing, say, mild to moderate anxiety disorder or depression or anger management issues or phobias is because they assign too much credibility to those negative thoughts, those negative emotions.
So how do we reprogram ourselves to assign more credibility to the positive or those thoughts that are serving us as opposed to those that aren't?
Well, it starts with learning. This is a great question, by the way. It starts at another level, which is spend less time internal and spend way more time external. In other words, so to gain control over your internal psychological space so it becomes more positive, less negative, the short answer is don't spend so much time with your psychological space switched on. Pay attention to the physical world. So like, for example, I teach a skill called walking meditation. I've been doing since a really young age, like age 14 or 15 on a regular basis. I first heard about it in a book when I was age 10, but didn't really start practicing it on a daily basis till about age 14. But I go for a morning walk pretty much every day. And on that walk, my mind, my internal mind, my psychological space is completely switched off most of the time, unless I decide to switch it on. So, for example, if I have to do a golf school this coming weekend and I haven't done enough planning on what my chore list is, I may decide, okay, for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to go internal and talk to myself or see visual images, meaning switch on my internal psychological space and go through a checklist of things I have to accomplish. But that only happens like 5% of the time. Most of the time when I'm on my walk, I'm looking at the sun, I'm looking at the clouds, I'm looking at the trees, I'm looking at people walk toward me, I'm looking at the car going by, I'm looking at...
And most important, I'm just going to add one thing. It's intentional. When you're you're choosing to switch it on, if you're saying it's happening only 5% of the time, it's not unconscious. It's not a reactor or something that's out of your control. You're intentionally turning it on, which is foreign to so many of us on the other side of this conversation, because our minds go a million miles a minute. And I think it's in Zen or Buddhism, they call it like taming the tiger, because it does feel like it's a drunken monkey or it's a tiger that's running rampant.
That's right.
And you're just like how do I tame this or control this aspect of myself?
Yeah. Because think of it, the old thing about when people have obsessive thinking, right? You may have heard, there's even a book called Don't Think of a Pink Elephant by George Lakoff, who's an NLP guy like I am. I mean, if you wrestle with obsessive thoughts, you're giving power to the obsessive thought. People say, well, how do I stop thinking about how bad my golf swing is? And I'm like, think about something else. I got a pain in my knee that's driving me crazy. What do? I go, stop focusing on it. Well, how do I do that? Focus on something else. So you shift in other words, the power that you innately are born with to have a measure of control over your attention is indeed almost like a superpower. You can shift your attention to something else and you won't be noticing the thing causing you suffering. So for me, because of all the training I've done for over 6 decades, my default is, if I'm by myself especially, where I don't have to interact with someone, because sometimes someone will ask you a question, you have to go internal to access your memory, right? But if I'm by myself on a walk, no, I don't have any internal spaces. The default is switched off. And it's very pleasant. It's a pleasant way of being in the world. When you're, particularly where I live most of the year, I live in a high alpine valley in northeastern Oregon. In the summer, I live on the beach in Hawaii. So I'm surrounding myself in nature all the time. So when I go for a walk, I've got beautiful stuff to look at. So why wouldn't I want to do that, right? Why would I want to?
You're living the dream, Jim. These places sound
absolutely. I know it. Yeah.
So I think we should recognize the fact that we live in a society right now where the mind, I believe, has been given way too much emphasis has been put on the mind, being intelligent, being scientific, and we almost put on a pedestal those thinkers that seem like they have a very crazy sharp mind, that they're always thinking always. And I feel like there's almost this kind of a natural kind of pushback against it, where it's saying, well, actually, we're seeking a certain amount of mental clarity and peace, which seems to come along with not having thoughts, with finding. I remember hearing meditation described as like taking a muddy glass of water that's been shaken up and it's very, very muddy, and just allowing that stillness to bring the sediments down to the bottom, so you can have more of a clear.
Yeah, or like a snow globe.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
But I feel like, having an empty mind is almost given a derogatory or a negative connotation, where you're stupid if you have an empty mind, right? Yeah. Like, no, I'm smart. I'm always thinking.
Well, here's why that happens. Because I get this question a lot, and some of it's, I'm even guilty of it, so I'm getting better at it lately. It's because there's a conflation between the word mind and consciousness. Consciousness, in the way I use the word mind, I try to use it more lately, are not the same thing. You could call your mind is that private psychological space. Consciousness is the beam of light, which can shine externally on the physical world or internally on your psychological world. So the beam of light is consciousness. But most people would, at least in the West, would call mind was what you're paying attention to inside your private psychological space. So if you're thinking about something, that's you can call that's mental event. right? Right? Does that make sense?
It does.
Consciousness is consciousness. So, for example, I'll put I'll put my consciousness right now in the big toe of my left foot, and I'm actually squeezing there's a ring, a support ring, like a footrest on my stool here that I'm sitting on, and I can simply pulse my big toe of my left foot. So my mind is feeling a physical sensation. Sorry, my consciousness is feeling. See what I mean about me still using the
It's hard.
Yeah. So my consciousness is experiencing a physical sensation. I'm not picturing anything, although I could picture my big toe like a visual image, right? But that would be a fantasy, right? So when you're picturing your body, you're not experiencing your body. You're experiencing a hallucination of your body or a fantasy of your body, right? Or I could say to myself, big toe, big toe, big toe. That's my auditory or my voice channel. Am I paying attention to my big toe? No, I'm paying attention to a voice in my head talking about a big toe. Right.
And I was just going to say, anybody that's done any sort of meditation work, you understand really quickly that there's a difference between thinking and thoughts. There's a difference between you observing your thoughts and your thoughts themselves. And if you can kind of disassociate or separate your consciousness from your thoughts, you realize you're like, where did that pink elephant image come from? You're like, I wasn't consciously thinking about a pink elephant, but all of a sudden it's entering my mind, which then begs a whole bunch of other questions, which is where are your thoughts actually coming from? Is there some sort of universal collective consciousness that thoughts are coming in through? Is it coming from someplace inside of our mind? And where's the consciousness? But bringing this back then to golf, which is, I'm notorious for overthinking on the golf course. My mind is, my buddies call me Cantley in a negative sense because I need to take a little bit of time over the shot.
It takes too much time.
Yeah, because I'm deeply in my mind. And the problem is that sometimes that works. It's like I'm almost like queuing everything up and really kind of seeing all.
Yeah, but sometimes throwing 3/4 in slot machines in Vegas, 3 lemons come up. That's just pure random.
I'm fully aware that exactly
randomness. Yeah,
fully aware. But yet I'm too afraid to just go up there, take a couple practice swings, and just like swing freely and let it go because I feel like I need to control all these variables for me to have a chance to hit a good shot. And I know this isn't the right way of thinking. So maybe help us to understand. What should we be thinking about or should be teaching our kids? Where should we be before a shot and after a shot? Like maybe let's focus on those 30 seconds before, during, and after a shot.
Well, that could be literally like a 4-hour podcast because then you're talking about what are the essential steps of a really good pre-shot routine and where should your mind be focused at each of those steps. So I'm going to give you a very condensed,
let's do that. Yeah, great.
Shorter answer. The answer is it depends. So in my system, which is called, one aspect of my mental game system is called the Waldron focal point system. In the focal point system, there's 5 categories of focal points. Focal point means where you choose to focus your attention. One of the rules for that is only 1 per swing, never 2, 3, or 4, only 1. Another rule is you have to sustain your focus on that focal point from the moment you acquire it, which in most cases is about 3 or 4 seconds before you start your takeaway. From that moment in time until the finish of the golf swing or the putting or chipping stroke, which is about 1.5 second time duration, you have to sustain your focused awareness on that object, that focal point, with no gaps in your awareness. But I'll give you some examples. There's 5 categories. One of the categories would be your body. And 95% of the focal points in the body category are only done in field channel, kinesthetic awareness. So for example, I could focus on my grip pressure, the feeling of my finger pressure on the handle. I could focus on sensations coming from the bottom of my left foot. And you should activate your core at setup. One of the setup fundamentals is you got to squeeze your belly button in toward your spine to activate your core. So you can focus on that sensation of squeezing your belly button in all the way to the finish. Another category unto itself is called target picture. And there's 4 different ways you could do that. But the most simple explanation is if you're 150 yards from the flag and you're hitting your 8-iron to that flag, you simply form an image of that yellow flag in your mind's eye while you're looking at it with your head turned toward it. You're an external visual channel. When your head turns back and you can't see it anymore, obviously, because your eyes aren't looking at it, you switch on internal visual. And so you imagine the flag and you keep that image of the flag in your mind's eye all the way to the finish. That's target picture, right? And target picture is far and away the most commonly reported focal point of great players. I've interviewed over the last 60 years. About 70% of the great players I've interviewed told me, nobody said 100%, but about 70% of them told me that about 2/3 of the time when they were playing their best, they used target picture. But very, very, very few amateurs use it. And the reason why is, if you're a mid to high handicap amateur and you're trying to focus on a target that's, say, 200 yards away, and you know your swing sucks, because let's say it does, because if you're 20 handicap, you don't have a good swing. So it's hard to believe that you have the capability of actually sending the ball there successfully. And that's one of my criticisms of most golf sports psychologists who teach, I think wrongly, that the only focal point you should ever use is target picture. When I first started teaching 32 years ago, for my first 6 months of teaching, I was what I call a target fundamentalist, which means I believe that the only thing you should ever focus your mind on is target. And I kept working with really good players, pros or top amateurs, who never use target picture. They might use grip pressure or they might use tempo, and they were great players. So I quickly realized, though, it isn't required to have your focal point be target picture. It could be something else, right? For example, it could be in your voice channel. You could, like Annika Sorenstam, she won, like, I forgot how many times on the LPGA Tour. And she told a colleague of mine that about 90% of the time she used the tempo focal point of saying in her mind, in her voice channel, 1, 1. So 1 on the backswing and then 1 again on the forward swing. And she wasn't focusing on the target.
So does that still, so you'd mentioned two, you mentioned one, which is physical, which is focusing, for example, on grip pressure, your big toe, activating your core.
Yeah.
Then you talked about a mental visual. So would that tempo be also within that kind of mental visual aspect?
Yeah,
or is
well,
it
it's mental, but it's not visual. It's auditory, because you're hearing a voice in your head say 1, 1. Remember, there's 3 primary sensory channels that we experience, both the physical world, external world, and our private psychological world, which are vision, hearing, and feeling. Obviously, there's also smell and taste, but we don't use those that often. So in neuroscience, those are considered secondary senses, right? In other words, at any given moment in time, your beam of light, your consciousness, is experiencing either the external world or the internal world. And you can't be on both worlds at the same time with a focused mind. You could have one deep in the background where you're barely noticing it. For example, where I have my finger right over the camera on the webcam. So that's taken up, my finger's taken up what 90% of the space on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
But you might be able to see my index finger way in the background, fluttering.
Sure.
We call that background awareness. Or if you're a golfer and you're on the first tee and you're focusing on grip pressure, right? And you got, let's call it 95% of your mind is on grip pressure. And 2 blocks away, a car backfires pretty loudly. Because your mind is in the foreground, 95% of your consciousness, rather, I keep saying mind, is on, still trying to redo my own language, is on grip pressure. Yeah, you'll hear the car backfire, but it's so soft, it's barely a whisper. But your buddies might jump up and jerk because they hear it much more loudly than you do, because their mind isn't focused. They're just standing there waiting their turn. So they may flinch. You won't flinch, right?
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Of course it does. And I guess it also tells me, when you think about somebody like Tiger or, some of the great players that are surrounded by thousands of people and, the flickering of cameras and lights and the murmuring of, voices and coffee and all the rest of that.
Yeah.
That kind of tells me that that's why they can tune that all out, because they're so 95 or 99% focused on one of these kind of focal points, either on the target, physically. What are some of the other ones here? I think you had mentioned 4.
Yeah, so there's target pictures category 1.
Yep.
Body is category 2. And
again, an order of popularity amongst.
No, that's not the target pictures for sure is number 1, but I'm not listing these in order. I just happen to have target number 1, but 3 is what we call neutral or non-golf. So there was a gal on the LPGA Tour, doesn't play anymore, named Natalie Gulbis, earlier, about a decade or so ago. And she would use a nonsense phrase because she had very little confidence in her golf swing. And because of that, she didn't have confidence that she could actually successfully send the ball to the target. So when she tried to use target picture, it triggered anxiety. When she focused on her body, it triggered anxiety. So she came up with the phrase, easy peasy lemon squeezy, which doesn't mean anything. It's a nonsense phrase. It distracts the conscious mind so you don't trigger anxiety or fear. Or you can say to yourself in your voice channel, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. or you could count backwards from 100 by 3. So if you walk into the shot, you would go 100, 97, 94, 91, 88. And when you do that, you have to keep the rhythm of the count the same.
And you actually have to think it through too. It's not just
that's why you have to change it. Every month or so. You got to change it so maybe like by 5 or by 2, or otherwise you'll memorize it. So the whole point, it's going to take a little bit of mental effort to do the math to distract you.
And that's to keep your prefrontal cortex, or that part of your brain, activate or occupied. It's a better word.
Yeah,
to free up your natural athleticism to swing freely.
Well, it's also to not have your amygdala. There's this tiny little organ. There's one on each hemisphere called an amygdala, which is the size and shape of an almond. And that organ has 2 main jobs. Number one, it lays down the initial tracks for memory formation. So when you have an experience and it goes into memory, there's a signal sent from your amygdala to your hippocampus, and that's where the memory is stored. It's like a vault, right? The second function of the amygdala is to scan your physical environment for threats to bodily injury and even death. And so when you're experiencing stress or anxiety or fear, it's because your amygdala has been triggered. Now, there's 2 types of amygdala response. There's rational fear and there's irrational fear. And unless you're playing in a big money game with the mafia, and I actually used to caddy for one of the mafia members when I was a kid in Chicago, and you can't pay off your bet, right? I won't tell you what my guy did to the guy who couldn't pay off the bet. Let's just say it was like out of like a Martin Scorsese movie, like Goodfellas, right? Or you're playing on tour for a living and you haven't paid your mortgage in the last 6 months because you haven't made a cut, and you have to birdie the last hole on Friday to make the cut so you can make your mortgage payment, so you don't end up homeless on the street. You could argue that's rational fear if you're experiencing fear. Everybody else, that means 99.999% of amateur golfers, right? If you're experiencing fear on the golf course of any kind, that's irrational fear. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's no reason to be feeling irrational fear, and that, of course, that begs the question: why am I feeling it then if it's irrational, right? And it gets back to one of our original bullet points, which is when you link your sense of self-worth to outcome and you hit a bad shot, you may experience a powerful human emotion called shame or humiliation, which is why most people who yip or anger, but that anger is actually more superficial. The deep thing that most everybody's terrified of is shame or humiliation, because the way we evolved as primates in a tribe of fellow primates, you couldn't survive on your own. You needed to have the support of your peer group. So we're hardwired to fear humiliation or rejection by our peer group. Yeah, it's not that you can't overcome that. You can, but I mean, that's partly why we have this issue. Yeah.
So I want to delve into fear and anxiety here in a second, but I'd be remiss if we didn't finish the 4th one. So I've got target, I've got physical, and then I've got the nonsensical Humpty Dumpty or easy squeezy. The 4th one.
These are called peak performance states, or PMAs, positive mental attitudes. So confidence can be a focal point for your mind. So you can trigger confidence the way I trigger or teach people trigger it. There's a step in the pre-shot routine. As you start to step into the shot and address the ball, you have to say it with conviction, otherwise it won't work. You have to say, I can do this. Or, pardon my language, I can effing do this. And that's how I do it when I demo it. And then I hit the shot. And my students, the first time, they'll go, I can do this. It's not going to work. Not going to work. You got to say it like you mean it. Right? Back to the thing we talked about the power of belief.
And you're saying the top players aren't, because to me, what I'm hearing here, I'm all excited because I'm like, I should string these all together. Like, I should do a deep breath out and say, I can freaking do this.
No,
and then I should focus on my grip pressure a little bit, and then I can put it in my
steps in the routine. Yeah, no, exactly. That's right.
Okay.
It's not just
string them all together.
These are a series of steps. So in my system, there's 4 steps to create the totality of the 4 steps. Create what we call a positive mindset. The first step is, you probably can relate to this, once you've picked a club and a target, if you don't commit to the club you've chosen and the target, you're going to have doubt in your mind. I've hit so many bad shots in my career because let's say I'm in between clubs, right? And I could hit a soft 6 iron or a hard 7. And I picked the soft 6. sometimes I get to the top of my backswing. I go, I think it's the 7. The thought, that thought will enter my mind, and I'll always screw up the shot, right?
Of course, we can all relate.
Yeah, to execute a golf shot, you have to be 1,000% committed, even if it turns out when you get to your finish that you picked the wrong club.
Doesn't matter, but at least you're committed. You controlled something that you could control.
Because when you're committed, you're going to strengthen the mind-body connection. You're going to put a good swing on it. So you'd find out if it was too much club or not enough club, right? But
yeah,
what you don't want is to bail out on any swing
because
you have doubt in your mind. That's the worst thing. Jordan Spieth should have won the Masters back in, it was either 14, 15, or 16. I forget the year. But on 12, the par 3 over Rays Creek, the wind's always swirling there in the pine trees. And him and his caddy, they had these long, intense discussions more than any other caddy and player on tour. And they said, okay, is it a stock 9-iron or is it a knockdown? Knockdown meaning lower trajectory, a little bit, maybe 5 yards less carry distance. So knockdown would be into the wind. You'd want to do the knockdown. So they decided to do the stock, which is, again, it's going to go a little further, a little higher trajectory. And he said in the press conference on Sunday after, I lost the Masters because I didn't commit to the shot I had chosen. And I changed my mind when I started my downswing, hit like a half inch behind it. It barely got into the water. That's how bad it was. It was like a shot you or I might hit. Like super fat. Then he goes to the drop zone. Now he's got a 70-yard shot with a 60 degrees lob wedge. Does exactly the same thing. Is it a knockdown or is it, right? He chose full, and he changed his mind, and he hit like a half inch behind it. He ended up doubling the whole cost in the Masters. So that's a perfect example of why lack of commitment is a bad thing. So you have to commit.
Love it. So the first thing, commit. Okay.
Commit. So I have
commit to the club.
Yeah, I have people say the phrase, this is a PMA, positive mental commitment. You say, after you've chosen your target and your club, you say the phrase with conviction, right target, right club. Now you're committed. All right, the next thing is called the carefree step. Now, there's a long version and the short version. The long version is somewhat depends if you're yipping. I'll assume someone's not yipping. You simply say to yourself, I can hit a bad shot here. That's okay. I can hit a great shot. That's okay, too. Let's see what happens here. That's the magic phrase. Let's see what happens here.
Wow. That totally frees you off from the result.
Right? You're accepting both success and failure in advance. Yeah. That is the magic phrase. When you say, let's see what happens here, you're proactively accepting in advance, early in the pre-shot routine, both failure and success. And remember, the more non-attached your psyche is, your ego especially, to both success and failure, meaning the less afraid you are of failure, and the less desire you have for success, the stronger your mind-body connection, the freer your swing, the better your ability to perform in anything you do, on or off the golf course. The whole point of Buddha, not the whole point, but one of the points of Buddhist practice is to be non-attached to outcome, both success and failure. The desire for success creates dysfunction, and the fear of failure creates dysfunction. Right. The third one is the breathing. You do calming breathing. And I prefer, there's hundreds of different ways to do this, but the one I like is 3-3-6 breathing, where you do a 3-second inhale, a 3-second holding of the breath, followed by a 6-second exhale. So it's almost like you're exhaling the stress, whatever nerves or anxiety you're feeling, right?
And you carry that breathing all the way through the shot?
No, this is all when you're standing behind the ball. You're 8 or 10 feet behind the ball early in the pre-shot routine. You haven't walked up to address the ball yet. It's all at the very beginning. Yeah. So you breathe out the stress, so to speak. Then you visualize the ball going to the target, right? That's the next step. Clearly visualize success. Then you take either 1 or 2 rehearsal swings without the ball, and you're rehearsing whatever your in swing over the ball focal point is going to be. So if I've chosen for today to use grip pressure as the focal point, right, I'm going to do two practice swings with my mind rehearsing the focal point.
And this can change from round to round?
The focal point can change from round to round, correct. Yeah.
But not hold the hole, ideally.
Yeah. And then the next step is you do confidence. You do, I can do this with conviction. And so now you're in a positive mindset.
That's fantastic.
Then all you got to do is do your aim and alignment procedure, do your setup procedure, and then you do what we call the automatic swing trigger ritual. You have to have a little ritual that you go through. In my way I teach it, there's 7 steps that you memorize. And the 6th step is when you start with, basically there's 2 triggers. There's an initial trigger and then a secondary trigger. And so you're you're accessing your focal point for your mind at the very start of that 7-step trigger ritual.
Incredible.
So it's a great way to play golf because it basically calms you down both mentally and emotionally, so you can strengthen your mind-body connection. Yeah.
I can hear so many people right now being like, okay, Jim, like, let me get your system. Let me figure out how to work with you, because everything you've shared it's clear what the value is. And it's also clear that there's still so much more to go into with this. So for those listening, those parents, like what's the best way for them to get a hold of you, to learn your Balance Point golf system?
Yeah. It's easy. Just I have, obviously everybody has a website today.
Yeah.
Just go to balancepointgolf.com. Yeah. And then shoot me an email, or you can send, there's a phone number on there. You can send me a voicemail or a text, and I respond usually within 24 hours. Well, this time of year I'm very busy. I'm usually booked out. I'm booked out in person till October right now. It's July. But I do a ton of webcam lessons, pretty much 6 days a week. So I do webcam lessons a lot, and I think I'm booked out right now 3.5 weeks on the webcam lessons.
Well, I can definitely see why. One last question for you, Jim. What would be one parting gift or advice that you would give to parents that, are raising a child that is showing an aptitude for golf and interest, and, they want to be the best parent that they can be to help support and nurture that gift? What would you say to those parents? What would be the advice that you would give, just to give them and their child the best chance to be successful?
Well, the worst thing you can do, I'll reverse engineer my answer to your question. The worst thing you can do is be a helicopter parent. And I mean, I believe the parent should not apply any pressure, even subtle pressure, to encourage the kid to practice or play more or compete. Let the kid set the agenda as far as his or her investment of time and energy in practice and in play. The job of the parent is not to push the kid to be good at golf. The job of the parent is to drive the kid to the golf course, pick him up at the end, encourage him when he's not doing well, praise him when he's doing well, but not too much, right? Right? Because again, you want to make sure that they have unconditional love, whether they do well or not do well, right? Yeah. But the big thing I see all the time is too much helicopter parenting. The parents too involved. One of the advantages of growing up as a baby boomer, when I was a kid growing up, I grew up in it was a rough neighborhood. There were bullies, but there wasn't really there wasn't like child kidnappings. There isn't even that much today. Most of it's overblown in the media. But the point is, the parents were doing their things. We grew up in the 50s. The kids, we did our things. We didn't have parents taking us here it wasn't like that. The parents weren't arranging play dates. We just would play with our friends all day long, on a weekend or in the summer. And we only saw our parents at night, like at dinner. That was it. So, I mean, I was encouraged to do the stuff my parents didn't have. They just said, just do whatever you want. Just go do whatever you want. And I did. I followed my bliss. I followed my passions, right? I think that's a healthier way to do it.
I love that. Don't be a helicopter parent.
Yeah.
Unconditional love, and encourage our children and ourselves to follow our bliss, whatever makes our heart sing.
Yeah. And the other thing is we did a little bit on this, but this is a big deal. You need to create, as a parent, enough what I call good suffering. Meaning you got, and sports can be this, but it doesn't have to be sports. It could be going on like a 15-mile hike, when the kid might only want to hike 10 miles. And you go, nope, Johnny, today we're hiking 15 miles. I mean, obviously I live in the wilderness, so my kids did this growing up. I live in the mountains, or you take them on a trip to a third world country where it's really hot and humid and there's no air conditioning, and the food's completely different. You expose the kid to radically different environments, physically, culturally, socially. It's like throwing a kid in the shallow end of the pool and saying, okay, swim, kind of like that. Provide a variety of experiences that are going to create a certain amount of discomfort or good suffering in the mind of the child. That builds character. But this idea that we see now, so many parents are overly protecting their kids, and they're providing too much pleasure, too much comfort, and the kids grew up to be narcissists, spoiled babies who can't handle life. You got to have good suffering. You got to have challenges for the kid. It's essential to their psychological well-being. Yeah.
It may sound counterintuitive, but I think every single one of us listening know on a deep intuitive level that what you're saying is correct. I mean, it's on the other side of suffering is growth. On the other side of the old adage, no pain, no gain. But if you're working out, you need to tear up your muscles a little bit for them to grow bigger and stronger.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
That seems to be the way that life is set up, that we need that little bit of resistance, that little bit of something to push back against so that we can grow. And without that, we don't grow. Well,
there's even a technical term in science for that. The Dr. Hans Selye, who came up with the stress response theory back in 1956, I think. People ran with that because we got to create a non-stress environment. And it turns out he wrote a whole book about this that came out in 1975, and he kind of was disparaging his original idea because people took it the wrong way. He said there's also something called eustress. With it was EU and then the word stress. And eustress is good stress, or what I call good suffering. You need to have, because obviously there can be traumatic stress. You don't want that, obviously, trauma for sure. But eustress is just enough stress at the right intensity level to get your attention. So your ability, so the instinct to switch on a higher level of consciousness kicks in. So you can deal with the source of the eustress and handle it. So you want to create eustress environments for your child, but not overly stressful environments, right?
Interesting. Yes.
Yeah.
And some of the ways to do that is what you've talked about. Expose them to new situations, new environments, traveling, new food. Don't helicopter parent. Allow them to fail a little bit forward with what they're doing. Don't always try and protect them and give them too much dopamine and too much comfort.
That's right.
Allow them to kind of find their way through a certain amount of independence. And I remember hearing this a little while ago that, when little Jimmy or Sally knocks over when they're young kids, when they knock over their tall blocks and start crying, don't go over there and start rebuilding it and say, it's okay.
Exactly.
Mommy or daddy just fixed it for you. Don't
right.
fix their problems for them, because
that's
you're right. The other side of that is developing a narcissistic man-child or baby. Spoiled brat.
Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Jim, we could have many, and we will have many of these conversations because you're a wealth of information and just wisdom. So again, I'm very grateful to have this conversation, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for all that you've shared for everybody.
Oh, thanks, man. It was fun. Have me back. We'll do it again. It'll be fun.